Steve Jones sat on the back terrace, watching the sunset on the sea. Perhaps they should have moved here years ago. The beauty and tranquility of this place was mesmerizing. Here means a small island off the north coast of Cornwall. For most of their 22 years of marriage, Steve's wife Claire hinted, cajoled, and finally persuaded him to move from London to here, where she and countless generations of her family had grown up. Improved communications and technology, and finally, COVID, allowed him to do enough work from home to make it viable, with trips to the capital limited to once a month. Claire, living in London, regularly returned to the island to visit family and friends, and most importantly, to see her mother. They bought the house from Claire's cousin 2 years ago, but only moved in 6 months ago. In the meantime, Claire spent her visits making repairs, using it as a base after the major building work was completed. The house faced west onto the bay and had a spectacular sunset that Steve admired while sipping a cool beer. The property was an old farm, and there were still meadows and orchards nearby, and it looked like a few new trees had been planted, no doubt part of Claire's landscaping the previous spring. Trees and orchards seemed to be a feature of the entire island, and Steve wondered if they were intended to provide shelter from the strong sea breezes or, most likely, to produce the much-loved cider of the locals. He had to admit it was a good move. Claire was right. It's a different pace of life among close circles, many of whom were Claire's relatives. Claire was happy to be back home and seemed to know everyone on the island. As an outsider, Steve felt a certain coldness from the locals, but he liked their straightforward manners. The way everyone had come together was impressive, and he wondered if it had something to do with the independence necessary for the survival of a small island community. Steve met Claire at university. Both studied business. Claire majored in marketing, and Steve majored in new technologies. They developed a strong relationship and married shortly after graduating, deciding to live in London for better work opportunities. They've been married for 22 years, but Steve still thinks Claire is beautiful. Over time, her hair became shorter, now pulled back and ending at the back of her head, and a golden hue was added to her usual blonde color. He knew she was worried about the 4.5 pounds she had gained over the years, but he liked that her figure had become rounder, her hips and bust more curvy. Her eyes remained unchanged, blue-gray with yellow specks in the irises. Unlike Steve, she never looked disheveled or wore sweatpants, maintaining a classic look. He had never seen his wife so happy, so involved in the life of the island and constantly participating in the work of one committee or another. Her current project involved organizing a solstice festival. Their 2 daughters, Nicole and Michelle, were born immediately after the wedding, grew up and went to study at Durham University. This was another factor that prompted Steve and Claire to move. Judging by their social media, the girls were enjoying university life to the fullest, but Steve was confident that they had time to get all the necessary work done, although Nicole tended to leave everything until the last minute. Steve was interested in the history of the island and enjoyed listening to old fishing stories in the local pub. There were several old books published, which gave an idea of the history of the island. These were kept in a small schoolhouse, which served as a library, as well as the village hall and venue for all social events. Steve looked around the attic of his house for the first time, thinking he might find something more about the history of the place. Mostly there were old beds, furniture, and toys. While digging around, he found an old box containing a handwritten manuscript called Tales from the Island. He made out the author's name, Melissa Taylor, and immediately discovered that it was his wife's surname. He sat down on a wicker stool and began leafing through. The handwriting was beautiful, a traditional font with swirls and flourishes, and the content was a mixture of stories and the author's experiences passed down through generations. Steve's attention was drawn to drawings of trees as he flipped through the pages. His eyes skimmed over the content. Some of it was faded and hard to see, but he could catch snippets. The tradition was founded in 1287. It was then, during the reign of the Plantagenets, that the law of the first night, also known as the jus primae noctis, law of the first night, was applied. As part of the marriage license, the ruling lord had the right to spend the first night with any new bride within his lands. Steve could remember a similar reference in the William Wallace movie starring Mel Gibson, but he was sure that this was a myth conveniently picked up by Hollywood to add a little voyeurism and excitement to the film's plot. Steve continued reading. Seeing the suffering this caused the groom, and in order to prevent any attempt at murderous revenge, the female elder spent one night with the groom. Over time, this escalated to one of the older women sleeping with the groom to ensure some parity for the couple. For 2.5 centuries, the plague dominated English life, wiping out the population. The island was not immune to the disease, and there were many deaths on it. Following a severe epidemic in 1622, there were concerns that the island's population might not be sustainable, and abandonment of the island was seriously considered. Sometime after this, rumors appeared about the substitution of partners on April Fool's Day. This was associated with efforts to populate the island, and widows were encouraged to seek partners among young men. At the outbreak of the Great War, almost all the men on the island enlisted in the British Army's PALs. Many young men did not return, so changes were made to the island's tradition to provide young unmarried men going to war with a surrogate partner before conscription. This practice was resumed to a lesser extent during the Second World War. The text goes on to detail Melissa's own experiences in the 1950s. The arrival of non-locals and the displacement of people undermine the tradition, but it still exists among some families. The elders insist that this is a tradition and that it has its value. Married women who have raised children are offered surrogacy for a young man who has reached the age of 18. For men, it relieves all the worries and pressure associated with losing their virginity. They also receive guidance from an experienced woman and end up becoming better husbands in the future. Divorce is unheard of on the island. This tradition also reduced the likelihood of unwanted pregnancy during adolescence. For women, it is seen as part of a community service, with a hint of reward after years of hard work raising children. Tradition also reduced the influence of the empty nest and the likelihood of illicit affairs. Melissa went on to talk about her own surrogacy for fine young gentlemen who had reached the age of 18, at which time she was 46. While her husband was busy with business, a young man, Robert, was working on their small plot of land, planting trees as a sign of renewal as part of the festival. His reward was time in Melissa's marital bed. The text gives the impression that Melissa's husband knew but never spoke about this arrangement. She described Robert's development from a shy and awkward teenager to a man. The first time was quick and awkward, but Melissa held him close, slowly making love. As the week went on, his abilities and confidence grew. It wasn't just the physical side of things. She explained to him her desires and feelings, as well as the important aspects of maintaining a successful relationship. Steve shook his head. Wow, what an amazing story, and began to wonder how much everything this is true. He could see some reason in the historical references, but everything seemed too far-fetched. All this could be the author's imagination, or she may have used it to justify her novel. A few months later, Steve was deciding when he needed to return to the city for work. Claire had a long shopping list that she wanted him to do, so he decided it would be best to add one day to it and another to see old friends. If he goes after the festival, he can return by next Saturday. Claire was thrilled, no doubt because Steve would be there to help with the festival preparations and that he had agreed to do her shopping. The festival day involved the entire island, with the day focusing on children's games and sports, with dancing and drinks planned for the adults in the evening. As the evening's program began, Steve was introduced to some of the island's residents he had not yet met, including John Fraser, his wife Angela, and their son Jake, who Steve thought was close to his youngest daughter's age. Jake Fraser introduced himself with a rather formal handshake, which was a little strange, but that moment soon passed. Along with the Taylors, the Frasers were one of the island's oldest families. Steve felt like an outsider again, while Claire and the Frasers discussed old family ties. Later in the evening, Steve noticed a group of young men looking at Claire. He couldn't blame them. Claire looked stunning in the summer dress she'd chosen, which certainly showed off her full breasts and shapely calves. The looks continued, which began to irritate Steve. He was about to approach, but Claire's mother beat him to it, forcing them all to hurriedly return to the cider bar. Steve laughed to himself, thinking that they must be a little wary of Claire's mom, Diana. On the other hand, he couldn't blame them. She was a formidable woman and the leader of the Council of Elders. Steve could see where Claire got her looks from. Diana Taylor remained a striking woman, more like Claire's older sister than her mother. He returned to watch the dancing, which seemed to involve all ages. Steve could feel the effects of the cider, but decided he could drink more. Everyone seemed to be in the same mood, and it took him forever to help himself. When he returned, he did not see Claire and began to look around. He was surprised to find her sitting at the table talking with Jake Fraser, who had moved away when Steve approached. "What do you mean?" Steve asked. "Jake is interested in carrying out some landscaping work. I asked about options and costs." "Do we have work?" "Yes, and there is a tradition of planting and renewing trees around the time of the festival, so that will be great." The mention of trees brought back memories of a manuscript Steve had read a few weeks ago. "So, Jake will plant trees?" "Yes, he can start next week." Claire looked at Steve. "Are you okay? It looks like you saw a ghost." Steve answered slowly. "What will Jake get in return?" "Money, of course, but we haven't agreed on the amount yet." "Would you provide any other services in exchange for his work?" "What are you suggesting?" Steve continued. "So, this has nothing to do with the traditions of the island?" Claire hissed. "What? What traditions?" "You know very well about the tradition of the solstice. You're in it? Planning to have sex with Jake Fraser while I'm gone next week?" Claire burst into tears and ran away. Steve stood there stunned. Hell, what if he was wrong and just falsely accused Claire? He was already beginning to regret drinking so much. His mind was clouded, and he couldn't think clearly. He began to climb up the single-track road towards their house. He needed a walk to clear his head. This walk was the longest of his life. Maybe he misunderstood something. Maybe he overreacted to this story. When I came home, Claire was not at home. He collapsed on the sofa, alcohol and fatigue finally getting the better of his thoughts, and he fell asleep. The next morning, he noticed that Claire had not returned home and thought that she might have spent the night with her lover, but he suspected that she was with her mother. This suspicion was confirmed when Claire and Diana appeared at the door. Her mother led the conversation, talking about not backing down, and she launched a verbal attack on Steve. There were so many words it was hard to keep track, but the gist of it was, how dare he talk to Claire like that? How dare he upset her? Nothing good comes from marrying a stranger. He was never good enough for her, and so on and so forth. Similar. He let her speak, looking at Claire with wet eyes. Finally, he had enough and raised his hand, trying to get her mom to stop. "I have a simple question. Is there such a tradition? And are you planning to go to bed with Jake Fraser next week?" Claire turned to her mother with a defeated look, and everything became clear to Steve. "Yes, Steve, some old families still have the tradition, or at least part of it. The Frasers have requested implementation of the agreement, and we are obliged to fulfill it." I asked Claire to think about it. "It's about everything related to a boy reaching maturity. Sex is only educational in nature and talks about how to treat a woman correctly. This is not sex in your understanding and not an affair. This is a centuries-old tradition that has helped the island survive difficult times. It is an absolute requirement that we fulfill this role on behalf of society. We have no youth crime, no divorces, just happy marriages and families with strong ties. You probably noticed this yourself." Steve sighed. "So it's all true. Married women are entertaining thirsty young guys in the name of the public good." Diana replied, "Don't be so vulgar. You're a stranger and you don't know how important this is to us. It's ingrained in every story we hear growing up here. If you were from here, you'd get all the benefits at 18. and that would make you a better man. I doubt you would refuse this offer." Steve replied, "Now there are no ancient laws, plagues, or wars. You do it because you enjoy it. Tell me, Diana, how many times have you played this role? An attractive woman like you was probably asked for several executions of the agreement. I bet you've had a lot of fun for weeks." Finally, Diana seemed speechless, but then recovered. "Yes, I have fulfilled my duties several times, and I am proud of it, just as you should be proud of Claire's sacrifice. I beg you, Steve, let Claire do this. You can't understand how important it is to us." Steve turned to his wife. "So you want to do this?" I think so. I'm ready to make this sacrifice. Like my mother said, I want to become part of society. No one was happy when I left for university, got married, didn't come back here, and didn't fulfill the responsibilities that fell to others." Steve replied, "So this is a sacrifice? Don't you strive for this yourself? It seems strange, considering that you were so happy that I was going to London. You were so excited." Claire blushed and then continued, "I just felt relieved that I could arrange everything and ensure that it wouldn't affect you. And it will not affect me, I'm absolutely sure of that. This will not affect our relationship with you in any way. Besides having sex with another man, lying, other people knowing what happened, and keeping your clueless husband in the dark, you might be right." Claire and Diana winced at Steve's sarcastic response. Then Diana spoke. "Why don't we all give ourselves time to calm down and discuss everything? Now all the cards are on the table, as they should be, and nothing has happened yet." Claire stayed at their house, but they hardly spoke. Steve just couldn't understand why Claire thought she wanted to go through with this. He expected her to simply give up on the idea, but she seemed obsessed with the island's tradition, regardless of the cost to their relationship. Claire insisted that if everything was out in the open, everything would be better. She promised to be honest with Steve, even if it meant difficult conversations. Steve was partly surprised by her absolute faith and assertion that such an agreement would not affect their relationship. Diana returned on Wednesday while Claire was in the village, and he suspected that they had agreed upon a time between themselves. "Can we talk, Steve?" Steve nodded towards the kitchen table and they sat down. "First of all, I'd like to apologize. This shouldn't have happened and it's my fault, not Claire's." Steve replied, "Claire is more than capable of making her own decisions, and this decision seems to have already been made, regardless of my opinion. She loves you very much and is confident that you are strong enough as a couple to get through this." Steve answered gloomily, "In fact, you both don't notice how much this affects me. This is a real betrayal. I wasn't here when I was 18, and unlike everyone else, I didn't live my life knowing that this could happen to my wife. I naively believed that my wife would be faithful to me, as in wedding vows. I understand, Steve, and it must be incredibly difficult to explain how differently we look at things. We don't see it as infidelity, it's really important to us, and I know Claire sees it as a way to get back into the island community." After a short silence, Diana continued, "What will you do if she agrees to this?" Steve sighed, not wanting to say the words, but said anyway, "I won't stand for this." Diana seemed to weigh the situation before speaking. "What if there's a way to even things out? Maybe give you the opportunity to experience what you missed when you were 18. Steve must have looked as confused as he felt. Diana continued. "I talked to 2 other elders. We agreed that the elders would offer you an agreement similar to what Claire is doing." A realization finally flashed through Steve's head. "Are you suggesting that I have sex with Helen Brown or Moira Fraser?" Memories of meeting these 2 women flashed through Steve's head. Helen, a widow from a young age. Steve assumed she was about his wife's age, with long black hair and deep brown eyes. She maintained a trim figure and was certainly an attractive woman. Steve didn't know Moira Fraser that well, but he knew that she was happily married and related to the other Frasers. She is the headmistress of a small school. With mixed reddish-blonde curly hair, she has a more graceful figure, often showing off ample cleavage. Steve looked up from his memories. "Yes, Steve, the elders are willing to offer this, and I hope it shows you how much this all means to us. We didn't just put Claire in this position carelessly. Despite the obvious temptation, Steve thought the whole proposal was absurd. "You are an amazing woman, Diana, and also an elder. Aren't you also on the menu?" Diana hesitated, not sure if Steve was serious. "If this is what you need, Steve, then yes, I agree. I will not be the one who is responsible for the loss of centuries-old traditions." Steve shook his head, amazed at the lengths Diana would go to. He had a terrible feeling about how he would try to explain this agreement to his father and the law. "You know, Diana, some traditions have outlived their time, and it's right that they should fade away." Diana's smile faded. "Our offer stands, Steve, and you won't be disappointed. I can guarantee that. Think carefully." When Steve relayed the story to Claire, she already seemed to know about the elder's proposal, but Diana's inclusion left her in shock and crying. "I never thought that she would think about this. It's all too much." "I won't do that, Steve. All this must stop." Steve felt a wave of relief, finally admitting that this whole scenario was just weird. "Thank God. I can't tell you how glad I am. I thought this would be our end." Claire cried and spent most of the night either apologizing or repeating how much she loved Steve. The situation remained awkward and uncertain, with Steve still struggling with Claire's previous intentions and her view that the agreement was reasonable. On Friday, Diana returned, clearly furious about Claire's reconsideration, accusing Steve of being a manipulative bully and an outsider who could never understand her. Steve is tired of ranting. "Why don't you be honest, Diana, and admit that for you this is just a way to mock your husband?" Diana almost had a stroke. "Okay, if you want to know the truth, we're having a great time. A fit young guy in our bed, doing exactly what we say when we say it, is a dream come true. We give them everything repeatedly, and everyone in the Fraser family is gifted as." "Can you believe it?" Claire moaned. "Lord, Mom, shut up. You're ruining everything." Steve responded with a laugh. "Don't stop her. This is the most honest thing I've heard from her." Diana wanted to say something else, but Claire stopped her, asking her to leave and not come back until she agreed with her decision.